Our scripture today is from Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he was ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, he blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowd. And all ate and were satisfied, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. That last line always gets to me. There were about 5,000 men. We didn't count the women and children because why would we need to count them? But that verse and my reaction to it is a sermon for another day. Today is about the bread, rather the lack of it, or should I say the perceived lack of it. In our ancient story, a large crowd assembles on a deserted shore, and they're hungry. The worried disciples look around at their resources to meet the present moment. 5 loaves and 2 fish are about all they have to work with. It's not enough. Jesus calmly looks at what they have. He gives thanks for it. He blesses it. He breaks it into pieces. And then he simply gives it to the disciples and he tells them to pass it out to the hungry crowd. According to Matthew's imagination, the disciples distribute to the crowd the resources they have on hand. And the next thing you know, the entire crowd eats and is satisfied. The finer points of exactly how a little turned into too much is up to our imaginations. Was it a miraculous increase? Or did it have more to do with generosity? When someone is willing to share, it inspires others to do the same. The power of sharing is contagious. We can imagine that when the disciples began to pass the bread, those who had nothing gratefully took it. And those who had a little something tucked away in their tunics brought it out. They'd been saving it for supper, but everybody else was sharing. They could too. Whether by magic or by simple human goodness, the crowd ate and was filled. Even though the disciples thought that what they had was lacking, it ended up satisfying the entire crowd. They even had leftovers to gather up and put aside for a rainy day. I think the very best stories are those that continue to resonate in all kinds of different contexts and cultures, even thousands of years later. And for my money, this is one of the very best stories. Just as the disciples asked, where will the bread come from to feed all of these people? Who hasn't wondered the same thing? What happens when we don't have enough? As a pastor, I can say that on some level, that niggling worry is always there for churches. Not only during a pandemic, when face-to-face worship is suspended, and the healing balm of physically gathering in one place is suspended, The weekly offering plate that sustains our church's ministry is also suspended. And at this time of year, when we're planning for next year's ministry, this church, like a lot of churches, worries that we won't have enough. Yes, the pandemic is a complicating factor, but we've always worried we won't have enough. Every single church I know, and I know lots of them, fret that they may not have enough to sustain ministry in the coming year. And many, many households are worrying the same thing this year. Up until this year, household income in the United States had actually been on the rise. Household income rose sharply last year, and poverty declined. Our country had experienced a record-long period of economic growth that ended abruptly when the coronavirus pandemic struck. But last year, in 2019, median household income rose for every racial group in every part of the country. 2020 is a very different story. Needless to say, it's a whole new world, and all of a sudden, a lot of people are worried that they won't have enough. You or your family might be among them, looking at your meager resources, anticipating that you're about to be laid off from your job, or you may be, or maybe that's already happened. Your income is decreasing and your financial obligations are piling up. If you personally are not hurting financially, then you probably know somebody who is. Today, we kick off our annual church initiative in which we plan for the coming year of ministry. This year, we're starting with a church-wide project called the Ripple Project. A warning, it's kind of crazy. But if there ever was a year to do something unorthodox, this is it. Our church has always responded to need. We support local and global organizations with money and volunteer time and collections. Those kinds of efforts are very, very important because they serve people in need on a larger scale than we possibly could as an individual church. And by the way, if you are newer to this church, excuse me, you might not realize that we are very generous in our budgeted giving to other organizations. Year in and year out, we are among the top churches in our conference in giving to our church's wider mission. I don't say that to brag, just to state that we as a church place a high priority on generosity. It's also why we place great importance on developing the spiritual practice of generosity among our congregants. If you have ever had the personal experience of directly helping a person who needs it, then you know how that feels. You know something of the spaciousness that opens up inside of you when you share, when you offer your limited resources and a humble and sincere effort to help another person. All sorts of research points to the connection between generosity and well-being. Quite simply, we are happier people as we overcome the fear of scarcity and loosen our grip on the money that is within our grasp. Now, maybe you are somebody who knows what that feels like, somebody who's lived a very generous life, and you've often helped people who needed it. But maybe you haven't. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. We all have different journeys toward developing the spiritual practice of generosity. Open-hearted generosity is an experience that this church believes is helpful. And so here's what we're going to do. We are going to give $100 to every family that is a part of this community. Those who have been around First Congregational Church for a long time, as well as those who just discovered it recently. We want to give you $100 per family, and there's just one catch. You are asked to give it away to somebody who needs it. Now, if we were meeting face to face, I picture myself with a stack of $100 bills, and I would just pass them out. Wouldn't that be amazing? It's not going to work now, of course, but we have a plan. There are a few ways that we will distribute the money. If you're tech savvy and you have a Venmo account, we'll put $100 in it. You just have to message the church office and let us know your Venmo username. Or, number two, you can drive by the church tomorrow and pick up $100 cash. I will be in the church parking lot tomorrow from 4 to 6 with a few volunteers to help. And during that 2-hour window, drive by, I will hand you an envelope with $100 per family. I will be wearing a mask and gloves, and I will not get close to you. Or, number three, if you're not able to do either of those, let the church office know, and we will deliver to your door $100. The only thing we ask is that you give that money away to someone who needs it. Then, if you're comfortable, I would love to hear from you about the experience. What did you do with the money? How did you decide what you would do? How did it feel to you? I know this is unusual. Typically in October, we'd be asking you to share your money with the church and make a pledge to support next year's ministry. We will get to that. But we first wanted to test a thesis that the way we spend money really can make us happy. I strongly suspect that you will feel happiness when you sit down with your family or you think through yourself about people who need help and then respond, even in this small way. We've never done this before, and you might have questions like, $100 for 100 families is $10,000. Where is that money coming from? Well, a couple of years ago, we established a permanent fund to sustain our congregation long term. Estate giving goes right into the permanent fund, and it cannot be used for operating expense. Of initial contributions to that permanent fund, we set aside 10% that is designated for outreach. Currently, the balance of those funds that are designated for outreach is about $22,000. Cabinet voted to use $10,000 of it to fund the Ripple Effect project. It's just one more thing that Shirley Sowers, by leaving her estate to this church, has made possible. Number two, can I just commit to giving $100 of my own money to somebody who needs it? Do I have to get it from the church? Well, you can, but it sort of defeats the purpose of our church serving the community, and it messes up the whole theological analogy of the disciples passing out the loaves and the fishes. Get it? In the story, Jesus blesses the bread, but the disciples are the ones who carry it out. This church needs you, all of you, to represent our church in the community. You can always give a little more of your own money if you want to, but we really hope that you will start with $100 of the church's money. I know it will take some effort for you to receive it, either by driving to the church or messaging the church office, but gosh, I hope you do it. Number three, do I need to give to an individual or can I give to an agency? Either. You decide if you'd like to give to someone you know or give to a stranger or an agency that serves people in need. If you pick up a cash envelope tomorrow, it will look like this. It will have 5 $20 bills in it. You can give to 5 different people a $20 bill. If you pick up carryout from your favorite restaurant, you can tip that person $100 if you want to. I guarantee restaurant workers are hurting. If you're concerned about musicians who have lost their income because they can't tour or do concerts, pick one of them and send it to them. If you know someone who's struggling financially, but it feels awkward just to offer them money, this gives you a way to do it. You can go to them and say, my church gave me this money and I have to give it to someone, so I'm going to give it to you. Or you can give to your local food bank or shelter, make a donation to any one of a number of nonprofits who are struggling. Get creative. Just give it to someone who needs it. Last question, do I have to give cash? No. If you're more comfortable depositing that money and writing a check, that's fine too. We remember fondly gathering together in our sanctuary for worship every week. We haven't been able to be in our building for months now. But this church has never been a building. You are the church. We are the church. This has always been true, but it has perhaps never been more obvious. You are the ambassadors of this church, dispatched into a hurting world. I imagine this chain of kind and compassionate encounters as you carry out generosity into Fort Worth and beyond. Poet James Foley writes, drop a pebble in the water, just a splash, and it is gone. But there's 100 ripples circling on and on and on, spreading from the center, flowing on out to the sea, and there's no way of telling where the end is going to be.